We're going to be talking about space, installation, interaction, and media. And Kathy Brew will be moderating the panel. She'll introduce the artists. And again, I'd like to extend an invitation to the opening reception tonight, which is from 6 to 8 p.m. at the Winter Garden at the World Financial Center. So we hope to see you there, and we also hope to see you tomorrow. So, Kathy?
Thank you, Bruce. Well, we just came back from a lunch break, and as was discussed this morning, there's certainly multiple definitions, and maybe too many of them for a lot of what we're trying to talk about here. I don't think this afternoon we'll be talking about the space that Roger Molina referred to at the end of his keynote. I don't think we're going to get into zero-G here. And installation, interaction, and media, again, are very broad terms and concepts, but what came up at our lunch conversation was the fact that some of these definitions, especially in terms of new media, I mean, artists have really been working in these forms for a long time. To date, myself, I actually first met Perry Hoberman, who's on the panel here, in 1985 when he was an artist in residence at Cap Street Project and did a site-specific installation called Dead Space Living Rooms. This was pre-new media art. And as he said at lunch, I mean, at that time he was just sort of, you know, an artist and who was working in installation. I'd like to just pose a few questions for everybody to think about, and then I think how we're going to deal with this afternoon's panel is really just to get an exposure to the range of work that we're very lucky to have up here today. We have Bernard Leitner, who's here from Vienna. You'll be able to experience the piece of his headscapes that was selected as one of the pieces for the digital salon down in the World Financial Center. As Bernard explained to me, there's no way he can really appropriately play that sound for you here, and that's part of the issue that will come up about space, about presenting this kind of work in the kinds of spaces. Then we'll be hearing from Perry Hoberman, who teaches here at the School of Visual Arts and shows with postmasters, and as I said, has a long range of working with media, with installation, working with both high and low tech work. We'll then move on to David, and Perry's piece Timetable is also down at the World Financial Center, so he won't really be going into that work here. Then we'll move on to David Rokeby, whose piece was selected, The Giver of Names, for the Digital Salon, but is not, for possibly spatial reasons, not able to be seen. But we'll get some exposure to his work here, and then Tony Dove, who's been working in interactive cinema and narrative, and I actually recommended Tony be added to the panel. I thought there'd be a nice segue because she actually works with some of David's software, so I thought there could be some interesting crosstalk. But I'd just like to pose a few questions for us to all think about in relationship to these concepts. Why interactive? How do you engage and sustain the interest of the user, visitor, player in an interactive experience? Does interactivity promise a more profound experience than more traditional responses to art and design? What does it add? How is it measured? Is there more sense of participation within an interactive work when compared to conventional cinema, theater, painting, or architecture in emotional terms? How do you engage the emotions of the audience and user? This question is crucial to interactive art, where the user's response is sensitive to context and can influence not only the form and content of the work, but also in some cases the future direction of technological development. Is there a tension or conflict between metaphor and spectacle in interactive work? How do we conceptualize interactivity and actually incorporate emotional values? Artists and designers seem compelled to expand the sensory capabilities of our bodies. What do we gain through this process? How does your work change how we experience perception and feeling? How does immersive experience change our point of view? How can interactive experience create a social as well as an individual experience? How do we create work that sustains human relationships and social dynamics? How can interactive technology be used to create social experiences? it seems hopefully eventually the attention is going to move away from the machines and the technology to the value of the experience that the work really offers. How does it enable us to feel and behave? How can it enhance that intangible thing, our humanity, I guess, referring to what, again, Roger Molina talked, how can we think about this in that post-humanism time now? So I'll just throw that out on the table, and then we'll have conversation among ourselves. And should we open it up to Q&A after each person's presentation, just for direct questions about the work, and then open it up to a larger conversation? Okay. So Bernard.
Thank you. I would like to speak about acoustical space. And I have to go back briefly to the late 60s and early 70s. After having worked with color and light as parameter of space, I thought around 1969, 1970, that sound could be, for the first time in history, and should be, and actually must be, seen as a building material, as a sculptural material. I'm not talking about acoustics in traditional architectural terms, like resonance, material, proportions. I'm talking about sound as a material like wood, glass, steel. So I thought if you have a series of speakers, for instance, and you move sound along this line, then you delineate space, you create space. It was a totally new field, and I had to start with a kind of research, investigation. How do we listen to space? I repeat, not to traditional space. How do we listen to space created through sound? And it became very clear to me after the very first experiments I started in 1970-71, actually on 36th Street between 8th and 9th Avenue, that we do not listen to space, to sound space with our ears, but that the entire body is an acoustical instrument. I would like to show you a few images from that period. What I call the period of artistic research. I had to do these investigations because I mixed actually the world of sound with the parameter of time and the more traditional world of sculpture and architecture with the conventional ideas of space, so to speak, conventional. So when you look at this image here, you can see that the sound was creating a kind of a swinging space, and you listen to this space and you are embedded in this space, obviously with the entire body, and you listen with the soles of your feet as you do listen with the top of your head when you turn this image around and you have an arching space. It took me about 4 years in a kind of a laboratory situation to create this new language or this new vocabulary. Like this image shows a wedge-like space with the sound moving along these 2x4s, first having the scale of the head, and then at the very end having the scale of the full body. So what is the sound space which sort of narrows the body measure up or down to the size of the head? Another setup was the gate. If you want to, a first architectural example, when you have a line of 16 speakers and the sound moves along this structure, and then it became very clear that if this is a soft sound, if it's a loud sound, if it's a fast line, if it's a short line, you come up with totally different new characteristics of space, which we had not known in the more traditional vocabulary of space. It can be a leading space, it can be a stretching space, it can be a elevating space, it can be a prickling space. It has totally new different words. Another experiment from this period was listening to a vertical space, sound moving vertically up and down through the thorax, through the back and the chest of the body. And here again, it was quite clear that the ears are involved, but basically it's the body who transfers the meaning of this experience to the brain. Another interesting discovery was that, as opposed to traditional space and meaning of space, acoustic space can have different scales at the same time. You can be in a very narrow acoustic space and in a very large acoustic space at the same time. Of course, the parameter of time is very important, so it has a beginning, it has an ending. And you are not only involved and engulfed by sound motions, closer, by sound motions, but the sound can also move through your body. So this idea of you are in a space and you look sort of vis-a-vis to the space as a traditional built space does not apply when you talk about acoustic space. Acoustic space goes through the body. And that, ever since I discovered that, has become a very important aspect of my work. It can even stay within the body, as you can see in this picture, which started first with a regular deck chair, which I bought somewhere here in New York on the pier, and I attached 2 commercial speakers, and the sound moved from the top of the body down to the feet and back again. So it was sort of creating a space you listen to inside your body. What was interesting to me when I showed this piece at the Documenta number 7 in Kassel, 2 medical doctors came up to me and said they wanted to do studies with that. And it was actually tested in Germany on 60 patients, pre- and post-operational situations. And on thermovision photographs, you could see that where the sound enters the body, the colors change to yellow and red. So it's a very particularly warm spot. The entire body heats up when the sound moves within the body. But where the sound enters the body, these 2 spots, so to speak, become extremely warm. What I liked about this situation in Bonn was that scientific research followed artistic research and not necessarily the other way around. The idea, if you want to, or that this language or this vocabulary did not have any scale. So it could be a body-size object like the sound chair, or I will show you 2 more a little later, or it could be a large-scale installation, or it could be something which is at an urban scale. And I will show you 3 examples of a large-scale sound space installation. What you see here is the sound space at the Technical University of Berlin, which was commissioned in '83 and finished in '84, a kind of electronic architecture which still is running today. And it has perforated walls. So you change 2 very important parameters if you want to listen to acoustic space. This is light and resonance. So I reduced the resonance time from the surrounding spaces from 6 seconds to 1.5, and I changed the lighting to such a degree that your acoustic antennas become sort of more alert. 48 speakers are distributed behind these perforated walls on the ceiling and on the sides, and there's a set of 20 or 25 programs which are changed every week. An interesting thing is, and that's probably new too, since this is electronic architecture which has a primary architecture which is like an instrument, that's the metal cube, to play sound architecture, to play these virtual spaces changing every week or every 2 weeks, whatever. What I liked about this commission, that it was followed up with a maintenance contract. So like any elevator which has to be served, they accepted the fact this is an electronic work of art or architecture. It has to have a maintenance contract, and this is the very reason that this work is still functioning and is actually it's being changed because I can change the sound, and it works very well, and it's almost 20 years old. Another very different application outdoor is the Cylindre Sonore in the Parc de la Villette in Paris. Here again, I create an architectural shell, an infrastructure, and behind these perforated panels, you have speakers mounted to create, again, changing the program every week or every 2 weeks, to create different sound spaces. Prickling spaces, kneading spaces, circling spaces, spaces which sort of play with the wind or whatever. It's a very, if you want, it's a very solid structure with concrete walls. But then when you have, for instance, the program of prickling sounds coming from all sides, very high-pitched trautonium sounds, you feel like in a totally different space, and you don't really pay attention to these rather massive walls. A little footnote to interactivity. I had a very strange experience with this piece. One of the spaces which are played there is called a prickling space, very high-pitched sounds. I think you see, right, very high-pitched sounds coming from all sides, creating a very strange web of rhythmical, a rhythmical net surrounding this. One day I approached the cylinder and I heard my piece. I said, it's not possible, it's much too loud. All the amplifiers have been changed or whatever. That wasn't the case, everything was fine. What happened in the bamboo bushes, you had a lot of birds, and by chance, that was the same frequency they could understand, and they picked it up and played it back. So that was the kind of interaction between nature and art, which I liked very much. When I had an intermission in my program, they played, and the other way around. The last example for these large-scale installations is a castle, a medieval castle, 16th century, in Lower Austria, where you have an inner courtyard and you have one speaker in the floor and 4 speakers up on the top at the level of the cornice. So this is the speaker mounted on the floor, and then you see one of the 4 speakers at the level where the roof starts. And what I do in this particular case, I project the top 4 speakers towards the center and create the sound you hear right in the middle of the rectangle open to the sky. So actually the sound goes from the courtyard into the sky because of projecting it from 4 or 2 sides. Here again it's interesting. If you play such a piece outside, depends on the temperature, on the light, on the season, how you experience that. Outdoor pieces, like the one in Paris or the one in this castle, are never ever the same because you are not the same. Again, an experience I had in Paris when I set the amplifiers to a certain level in the spring. They sounded very differently in the summer, and again, much different in the winter, because the air, by sheer laws of physics, is more transparent for acoustical waves. The same thing is true for our skin. So there is an interaction between our skin, our reaction to light, muscles, temperature, humidity, and also pure physics, how sound travels through the air under different conditions. This last example of the vertical space, I then, by changing the scale, recreated in an object where you have two levels, similar to the installation in the castle. One is the basis you stand on, with a speaker mounted inside, so you hear the sound with your soul, and then the sound moves upward through the ring and is projected by these two speakers about 2 or 3 feet above the ring. So by using metal, I use the material itself to create another dimension in acoustics, by projecting sound and by using the resonance of the sound. So you stand there and you really feel like you are the column. Below is the bass, and you feel the bass with your soles, and above is the capital of a classical column, and it rises through your body upward, like elevating you from this earth. The last object I want to show, which is very similar to the last one, it has to do with projecting sound through metal sheets in this particular case. You have two edge-like spaces to the left and the right of the seat, and you have two speakers in the upper edge space projecting the sound into the edge. So the sound must leave through the metal sheets. And the result is that these two metal sheets project the sound in the center, and you have it in your body, but you don't have a speaker anywhere, but you have the sound within your body being projected by two metal sheets activated not stereophonically, but monophonically, obviously. The lower shed has two speakers pointing outward. So there you have the experience of a very wide plane. Now it's not very difficult to imagine or do what I try to do. I try to play between a very wide space, like a plane, horizontal space, and a very narrow space, which is inside. And what is interesting in this piece, this morning somebody mentioned outside-inside and the tension of outside-inside. One doesn't really know where the inside starts and where the outside starts, because it really goes and penetrates you completely, and then it opens up again. So you are in an oscillating space, but not sort of vis-a-vis, but you are the oscillating space yourself. What I'm showing, and this is now the last example I wanted to present, what I'm showing here is a production, a piece I did at the ZKM in Karlsruhe, the Center for Art and Media, and it's also published by ZKM, and it's called Headscapes. Here I wanted to use the head and the sound we can perceive not as a representation from something exterior, but I wanted to compose something for the head, taking the head as a hollow globe, a hollow sphere. Does the brain hear itself is an old philosophical question. Obviously not. Otherwise it would interfere with itself. But the spaces I create is like sculptural, architectural spaces through moving sound or through massing sound within the space can only be experienced through earphones and not through regular speaker setup. One last word about this vertical space and this inside-outside piece. It's an old idea, but I could only do it recently, the last few years, because of pitch shifting. It is very important that the upper frequency, the upper tone, is clearly distinct from the lower one, but it cannot be a musical step. Whenever the brain listens to music, it doesn't listen to space. So it was very important from the very beginning not to be musical, not to have melody, not to have musical rhythm or musical patterns. So I did not want a quarter tone step, but if I take a quarter tone, which is 50 cents, and then I have 28 cents, then I do have a very clear psychological distinction between A and B, but it's not a musical, you're not listening musically, you're listening biopsychologically, maybe that. The same thing is true for the inside out. They have to be absolutely parallel, otherwise it doesn't work. It must be an absolute parallel opening and closing. Again, this could only be done through the digital technology we have today. So what I'm showing here is the last 2 or 3 images are graphics about, they're not illustrations, but they're graphics about this last work, headscapes that you really don't have a scale. It could be large, like this famous project by Boulet. It can be just focusing on the center of your head, and you turn the eyes inward and you listen by looking at your head, or it can be like this graphic shows, it can be sort of the imagination of larger structures. But at the same time, it can be close and wide, it can be intimate, and it can be the opposite of that. Recently, there has been very much talk about the relationship between brain and body. As Damasio says, it's not that I'm trembling because I'm afraid, but I'm afraid because I'm trembling. So the body gives the message to the brain, and then the brain gives the message to the body, but maybe it's even more complicated than that. Anyway, by pretending there's no brain, I can always ask the question, and I think it's legitimate to do that as an artist, where is the brain? Thank you.
Oh, I have sound. Okay.
Does anybody have any questions for Bernhard before we move forward? Yep. I've been told we have a little bit more time than what was allotted for the panel, so that's why we're opening this up a little bit.
Not working. I wanted to ask you 2 questions. One was, could you expand a little upon the statement that the brain listens, when the brain listens to music, it doesn't hear space? And the other is, could you talk just a little bit about the responsibility of placing the artwork inside the body?
The responsibility?
The responsibility or your reflections upon that.
I don't quite understand. Why shouldn't I put the artwork inside the body?
Well, it's clearly, as you've illustrated, something that sound does uniquely, perhaps.
Okay. It's true.
But then there's also considerable discussion now about placing microtechnologies within the body.
I understand what you're saying, but it's not ultra wave, so it's not something you don't hear. On the other hand, I can say, maybe you're right, we don't know what we are doing, but then that might apply to many other things too.
I don't have a problem with it. I'm just interested in the philosophical point that it raises about placing this object that you've created.
My approach was more an empirical, and then the philosophy comes afterwards.
Actually, I've just been advised that we're going to shift back to just doing all of the presentations now. We'll open up to all the questions at the end. So our space and time is shifting here. We're going to move to Perry Hoberman, who's an installation artist whose work has been exhibited widely throughout the U.S. and worldwide, and he's going to show us some of these examples.
Sorry.
Hi.
Okay.
Can we switch the video over? Oh, I can switch the video over. Voila. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a couple other kinds of space. The first is what you're looking at right now, which is the space of my desktop, both virtual and real.